Easter, everyone. How are you? Well, you look better than that, right? So happy Easter. How you doing? You guys doing okay? I'm so glad you're here today. Thanks for joining us. My name's Shane, and if we haven't met, I'd love the opportunity to be able to meet, and I'm so glad that you would spend some of your Easter morning right here with the rest of us. I know you know this is true, but it's happened to all of us that none of us ever plan for that moment when everything changes. Like you didn't plan for that phone call, or I didn't plan for the conversation that actually ended something that I thought would last. You didn't plan for the diagnosis you got. You don't plan for disappointment. We don't plan for betrayal. We don't plan for that version of our life that we were counting on, and now it's just not happening. And the truth is, if we were really honest this morning, most of us aren't living the life we thought we would be living right now. And when something like that hits us, it doesn't just hurt, it feels final. More like a period in our life than a comma in our life. Like, this is just how the story's gonna go now. And maybe you've never said it out loud, but my guess is you've felt that, or felt this when we've thought, is this it? I mean, like, is this how this story ends? Is this how my story ends? And Easter started the exact same way. Nobody expected a cross. Nobody expected a sealed tomb, and absolutely nobody expected a resurrection. And so as we try to say every Easter, nobody expected no body. Like nobody was at the tomb that first Easter counting backwards from 10, 9, 8, 7, cue the sun, right? So we say this every Easter, that everybody expected Jesus to do what dead people do, which is stay dead, right? And that's what made it feel so final. For his followers, I mean, it was just over. For his friends, just over. For the people who had put their hope in him, just over. And the story didn't just take a bad turn for them, it ended. And this is why the resurrection of Jesus is relevant for you, even if you don't believe anything about that story. If Jesus had not risen from the dead, life's greatest mystery would have remained unexplained, which is the mystery of what happens when we die. I mean, because people have always tried to make sense out of endings like that. And we come up with ideas and theories and ways to explain what happens when life ends. But Easter didn't just show up as an idea to that. It showed up as an interruption to that. Because what looked final wasn't. And here's what makes Easter so different from everything else people believe about life and death. Because most ideas about what happened after we die are just that. They're ideas, like our educated guesses, our philosophies, our thoughts, things people hope to be true. And when people talk about it, even when they talk about it with a lot of confidence, there's usually this point in the conversation where it kind of trails off and they end up saying, it's just what I believe. And I guess we're going to find out one day. Because people want to know what happens after we die. And today we have this concept of heaven that our souls, when they leave our bodies, they go and spend eternity in heaven. And we get reunited with our loved ones. And it's kind of interesting. And look, this is not a criticism of that, okay? So don't take it that way. I mean, I've done so many funerals and I have grieved with so many people. It's mostly about, oh, they're seeing grandpa now, or grandma, or my aunt, or my great so-and-so. And then my sister-in-law or my brother-in-law, and oh yeah, and Jesus is there. And it's like it's all about having a family reunion in the sky, and it's beautiful. And that's okay. And why do we envision that? Because we don't know. We're just left to our imagination. And then it gets kind of fuzzy. Because what happens to people that live good lives versus people that live bad lives. And then if you said, well, how good do you actually have to be? Well, then it gets fuzzy again. If you ask the question, how good is good enough? That just gets confusing. But we know those people aren't good enough. We know that for sure. We definitely know that they didn't live a good enough life, although we're good enough. Just like most of us think today, you are confident you're going to heaven. You're confident you know some people who aren't. They might live next door to you. You might work with them, and you're confident they're not. You're not really sure why, but you're confident. But the claim of Christianity was never, here's what we think happens after you die. The claim of Christianity was, we saw something. People saw Jesus die, and I'm not talking metaphorically, and I'm not talking spiritually, I mean physically, beaten and crucified and buried, and they knew exactly where his body was buried. And then 3 days later, they're looking into a tomb that was empty. And nobody's first thought was, oh, he rose from the dead. Nobody thought that. Do you know what they thought? They thought exactly what you and I would have thought. Somebody came and took the body. Because dead people don't come back to life. They just stay dead. And then Jesus started showing up. First to his closest followers, and then to his friends, and then to people who had actually watched him die. And he had meals with them and conversations with them. Moments where they were looking at each other going, this isn't possible. And yet, here he is. We can touch him. We can hear him. And these weren't people who were easy to convince, by the way, because these were the people who had already lost hope. They were grieving. They were not expecting an outcome. They were grieving an ending because the resurrection didn't happen to people who believed it would. It happened to people who were convinced this is over. And if it's true, it changes more than just what happens when we die. It changes what we think about things in our life that we feel are already ended. Jesus didn't show up talking about theory. He showed up stepping into people's real lives, into their sickness, into their loss, into their grief, into moments that felt irreversible to them. And he didn't start with a conversation with these people about what happens after you die. He started with conversations about what the problem was in the first place. And he claimed to be able to fix the problem because he claimed to have authority and power to forgive people of their sins. Because he would actually say, your sins are forgiven. But then he went beyond that and proved his authority to forgive sins by reversing the consequence of sin. And the consequence of sin is sickness and death. And Jesus reversed it. When he healed a boy who had been blind since birth. When he told a man to rise up and walk who had never walked a day in his life, he reversed it. He healed people who were deaf. He healed men and he healed women. He healed all kinds of people and from every category of people. But the point wasn't the healing. That just validated his claim to be able to say that I have the power to forgive people of their sins. And I'm proving it by reversing the consequence of sin. And then he staged the greatest demonstration of his power to reverse sin. You might have heard this story. You might know this name. Maybe you grew up in church and you've heard this. Maybe you've never heard it. But the story is that one day Jesus was with his 12 guys, and they get word that their friend Lazarus is sick. And Lazarus is not a stranger to Jesus. He's a very, very close friend of Jesus. But instead of getting up and rushing to his friend's bedside to heal him, Jesus waits. And he just lets his friend die. Lazarus has two sisters, Mary and Martha, and as you can imagine, they are heartbroken. They're grieving. They're hurting. And finally, when Jesus seems to somehow know that it's too late for him to heal Lazarus, that he is dead, he says to his 12 guys, okay, let's get up and let's go to Bethany where they've buried our friend Lazarus. And when Jesus finally shows up and Martha, Lazarus' sister, hears that Jesus is finally walking into town, she can't wait anymore. And John, who was there for all of this, wrote down what happened. And here's what John said happened. He said, when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him. She couldn't sit still. She's not composed. She's not calm. She's not okay. She's mad. She's grieving. She's disappointed. I also bet she was rehearsing her speech before she got to Jesus. You ever rehearsed a speech before you got home? You ever been on your way home and you start thinking through all the things you're going to say and you've got this big speech? And isn't it great when you're driving home in your speech rehearsal when everybody just responds exactly like you want them to respond? And you're ready and you get out of the car and you bust open the door to start giving your speech and nobody's home. And now you got to wait. And they finally show up and you give your speech and everyone kind of has their own things and then they kind of come back at you about this or that and you're like, okay, in my head, this speech went very differently than this. And so look, Martha's not just marching out to see Jesus, she's got her speech rehearsed. She's not happy. You ever been unhappy with God? I mean, come on, of course. Ever been disappointed with God? I'm sure you have. We all have. And Martha was so disappointed with Jesus. And so she finally gets to him, and here's what she says. She said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Because if you had been here, I know you would have healed my brother, your friend. I've seen you heal strangers. I know you would have healed my brother. He was a close friend of yours. Come on, Jesus, we hosted you in our home. We fed you. You stayed there. You could have stopped this, but you didn't. And then Jesus says exactly what you would expect a religious leader to say. What basically somebody like me would say in a moment like this with someone who's grieving the loss of a loved one. Here's what he says. He says, Martha, your brother will rise again. See, that's kind of pathetic preacher talk, isn't it? Like, hey, don't worry. You'll see him again. You'll see her again. I mean, why do we say stuff like that? Why do preachers say stuff like that? Because we don't know what else to say. And so Jesus has kind of got his rabbi thing going, his pastor thing going on, except there was more to it as we're about to find out. Because he says, Martha, don't worry. And my guess is she's shaking her head because she answers him and she says, I know. Jesus, I've been to Sunday school. I went up to the temple. I know what the rabbis say. I've been taught this my whole life. I know my brother will rise again in the resurrection in the last day. That's sort of like us saying, one day you will see your loved one again in heaven. Because that's what she had been taught her whole life. And I don't know, but you know what I bet she wondered? I don't know this for sure, but I bet what she wondered is what you wonder. And sometimes what I wonder, what many of us wonder. Are those the things that preachers just say to us to try to comfort us during our grieving? I mean, is that just what the church says because the church doesn't really have any answers for this either? But Jesus wasn't talking theory, and Jesus wasn't talking theology. He walked into her pain to validate the reality of resurrection. And so I think Jesus smiles at her, and he says what no one expected him to say. And something no one would say if they wanted to be taken seriously. In fact, when John writes these words down, I can imagine John thinking, I heard what he said, but oh my goodness, nobody's ever going to believe that. It won't help the storyline. Maybe I should just leave that out. But Jesus looks at Martha and he says, Martha, come on, this isn't a Sunday school lesson. I'm not going to say what you expect me to say. It's like, look at me, Martha, look at me. resurrection isn't a category. And he doesn't point to an idea. He actually points to himself because he says, Martha, I am the resurrection. You are in the presence of resurrection. I don't just know about it. It's not that I can just explain it better than everybody else. I am the resurrection and I am the life. And then he said this, Martha, the one who believes in me will live even though they die. And this is crazy. In other words, the person who believes in me will live again after they die. And she's not sure what he's talking about, but he's also not done talking. And he goes on. He's like, Martha, follow me, follow me. And he says this. He says, whoever lives. In other words, whoever lives again in the age to come. Whoever lives again by believing in me. And all of a sudden, he puts himself into the equation. And it's like he's claiming to be the bridge between this life and the next, the bridge between this age and the age to come. Whoever lives by believing in me, he says, will never die. That he's saying there is no death after resurrection. There is no death in the world to come. And I know he could see the confusion on our faith, and it's like, wait, you got to go over that again, Jesus. And he's so great. He's so compassionate with her, and he's like, okay, I'm not going to try to explain that again, Martha. And then he asks her a question. And I'm telling you, it is the question for me. And this is the question for you. And it's not, do you understand this, Martha? The question is, Martha, do you believe this? And she's thinking, believe it? Maybe. Understand it? Absolutely not. But I'm still so angry with you. And what he's asking is this, Martha, do you believe in me? And I love her response. I mean, it is just so honest. It's like, yes, Lord, I believe, and I don't understand it all, but I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is come into the world. In other words, I don't understand it, but I trust you. I just wish you would have gotten here sooner. And then Jesus turns and he walks to the tomb where Lazarus was buried, and he calls his name, and a man who was dead walks out alive, and he resurrects his friend Lazarus from the dead. And this is the point of the miracle, that he reversed the ultimate consequence of sin, which is death. And so because of this, his followers should have known that a grave couldn't hold him. He is the walking, talking resurrection and life. And don't miss this. This wasn't just about Lazarus and his sisters. This was Jesus showing them and us that what I've done for him, what I've done for his sisters, this was Jesus' way of showing them and us, I can do for you as well. And not just someday, but in the places in your life that feel dead right now. Years later, a man named Paul, who we now know as the Apostle Paul, who wrote so much of the New Testament, he was a Pharisee who didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah until one day he met him. And once he met him, he believed, and he went to Jerusalem, and Paul went and met Peter, who hung out with Jesus. And Peter was like, oh yeah, we saw him die, we met him afterwards. And he met John, and John was like, yeah, we met him afterwards. And then he talked to Mary, the mother of Jesus. And then Paul runs into James, the brother of Jesus, and James is like, no, I didn't believe he was the Messiah either, but I watched him be crucified and die and comforted our mother, and then he showed back up. And so, yes, we absolutely believe. Because the people closest to this story, the ones who watched him die, claimed they saw him alive again. And they didn't just believe it, they built their lives on it. They suffered for it. Some of them died for it. And they taught the resurrection of the body, not as a theory, not as a philosophy. They taught the resurrection of the body, get this, as history. And why is it history to them? Because they saw Jesus die and they knew where he was buried. And 3 days later, they stared into an empty tomb. It was history for them. They did not assume that he rose from the dead, even though he predicted it. They assumed what every logical, sane person would actually assume. They assumed that somebody had simply stolen the body. And then when he appeared to them, he appeared to his mother and to his brothers, and he appeared to hundreds of others as well. And these men and women risk and sacrifice their life, not for what they hoped was true. They risk and sacrifice their life for what they were convinced they had seen. So back to us for a minute. If you've been around our church for very long, you've heard me say this, but I just think it's worth repeating as many times as I can repeat it. Look, we don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead because the Bible tells me so. The Bible that I read. The Bible I've been reading since I was a kid. We don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead because the Bible tells us so. It's different than that. Actually, we believe we actually have a Bible because Jesus rose from the dead. We believe that Jesus rose from the dead because Matthew, who was an eyewitness to everything we've been talking about, documented it. Mark, who got his information from Peter, who hung out with Jesus, documented it. And Luke, who went and interviewed every single person he could interview, and he documented it. And John, who was there for all of this, including raising of Lazarus from the dead, documented it. And James, the brother of Jesus, called his own brother his Lord. And not because of what he taught, because he didn't believe that, but because he rose from the dead. See, the Jesus movement didn't begin with people trying to explain something. It began with people trying to explain what they could not deny had happened. And the point is this: the effects of the resurrection of Jesus are far-reaching, for sure. But the effects of the resurrection are so personal. Because Easter isn't proof that bad things don't happen. Easter is proof that those bad things don't get the final word. And just so you'll have it, the resurrection of Jesus is your guarantee of that. Which means if whatever you walked in here today carrying, that thing in your life right now that feels final, might not be. That relationship, that loss, that disappointment, that version of your life that didn't turn out the way you thought it would, that has you so wound up, that's not the end of your story. Which means that the question isn't, do you understand all of that? Because honestly, none of us fully do. The question is the same question that Jesus asked Martha that day, and it's so relevant for us as well. Do you remember the question? Because the question was this: Martha, do you believe this? Martha, do you believe in me? And the question for you today, the question for all of us today, whether you've been a Christian for a long time, or you're considering it, or you're coming back, or you're thinking about leaving, or maybe it's the first time you've heard it explained like that. The question is, Do you believe this? And look, if you can't believe it, that's understandable. You can't make yourself believe something you don't believe. And quite honestly, Jesus' closest friends, they had a hard time believing it as well. But what woke up their belief was not what he taught. What awakened their belief is what we're celebrating today. An event, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And so here's the challenge for you. That Jesus predicted his own death and his own resurrection. And he pulled it off. And if that's true, he's worth your attention. And if Jesus predicted his own death and resurrection, and he pulled it off, he's worth your consideration. And just as Jesus in the first century invited people to follow him before they ever believed in him, you too are invited to follow him as well, even if you don't believe it all. Because the resurrection of Jesus doesn't just mean something happened back then, it means that something is still possible today. And it means what feels like an end isn't always an end. And perhaps, just perhaps, what you're going through, this is not how your story ends either.